Hello world! In our previous video, part 2 in the series, we began to discuss the practical applications to this radical teaching of Jesus regarding money and possessions. We'll be going into more detail in this short video about exactly how the first Christians started to put this teaching about money and possessions into their everyday lives, thereby practicing such extreme love. From the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, he called on his followers to leave their jobs, their possessions, and even their families in order to help him teach about a new way of living, which he called the Kingdom of God. For nearly 3.5 years, his first followers traveled with him from city to city, sharing about this radically new life he was calling others to join him in. As a natural result of living and traveling with Jesus day after day, the first followers shared everything they had with one another as an example of what this Kingdom of God looked like. Up until his death, Jesus had gathered about 70 followers, and the way of life he prescribed was to be the same for all who chose to join him in his ministry, sharing all things in common as a true family, a spiritual family, practicing what we would call the economy of love. So are we to assume that after his death and resurrection, something changed dramatically, and the teachings he told his first followers to live by had somehow become irrelevant? Not at all. To prove the very simple fact that his followers continued living the same way of life after Jesus' death and resurrection, we just have to look at the very first time in the New Testament describes his followers after these events, and this is found in what is called the book of Acts. In the 2nd chapter of Acts, we see an amazing description of the early Christians. Let's look at those verses. And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they sold their possessions and belongings, and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. It's so absolutely clear how these radical Christians continue to live together and share everything. But what if this was just a fluke, some isolated passages that somehow made their way into the New Testament? It might be tempting for some to overlook these verses if that really were the case. But just 2 chapters later, in Acts chapter 4, we see the same thing repeated about the disciples' lifestyle. Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to them were their own, but they shared everything in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many who were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. Wow, there it is again. There's no ignoring it or avoiding it now. Given that this is how the early Christians, the first church, lived, and relating all this back to Jesus' teachings about money and possessions in the Gospels, shouldn't this cause us to seriously consider that the original blueprint for those should equally be applied to any of us who claim to be following Christ now? Just think about it. Wouldn't this be a profound testimony of love to the world if Christians still practice these things? After all, if Jesus said, "Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples," then wouldn't this be one of the greatest ways to exhibit this kind of love? Today's churches love to talk about love, but if you ask the world if they have witnessed this radical kind of love in the churches that the early Christians had, it's easy to see that the answer would be an emphatic no. Until those of us who claim to be followers of Christ can get our own act together and show the world what Jesus' unique vision for humanity can look like, all of our talk about love will be hollow and easily dismissed by the world. So what about you? Are you willing to be a revolutionary example of the true love to others? If so, we hope to hear from you soon. Stay tuned to keep up with our next videos in this series, as well as our videos regarding more of Jesus' teachings. Please share this video with others, and don't forget to subscribe. Peace.